So for those of you who aren't in my lab, in case you don't know me, my name is Connelly Cowan. I'm a rising junior debating at Georgetown, and I wanted to do this elective about practice speeches because I personally am a huge practice speech fan. I give a ton of them all the time. I review everything. But I think that it's kind of easy to think of that as not useful if you're unsure how to go about it. And so I wanted to kind of deliver to you some of the things that I find useful. I also, when I went to camp, I got a lecture of this sort from Will Katz, so a lot of this is inspired by him because I didn't know how to give a practice speech or redo it at the time, and I found it really helpful, so I wanted to do that for a lecture. Okay, so why give a practice speech? There are a lot of different reasons, and I think it's important that you never give a practice speech just for the sake of giving a practice speech. It feels easy that that's a thing you should do. But if you're just kind of going through the motions, you ultimately aren't going to take a whole lot away from it. And so instead, giving your practice speeches with intention, I think, is really important. So some kind of possible reasons that you might want to give a practice speech include things like practicing a new argument, working on building new skills. Maybe there's a weakness that you want to target, or there's a type of debate that you haven't really had a ton of before for whatever reason. So you all debated last year, I would assume, and have had a bunch of DDEV debates. For me, that was something I didn't really ever do in high school. So there was a period of time where I gave a ton of DDEV speeches just to learn what that type of debate is like and develop the skills to have that kind of debate. And then you also might want to redo a speech from an actual debate that you had. And I think there's a lot to be gained from doing that because you get to take a lot of the context that exists in a real live debate and then work on using that to get better. But the most important thing here is just that you have a goal in mind. Every practice speech, before you give it, you should be asking yourself, what is it that I'm trying to get out of this speech? And you should check in with yourself afterwards to figure out, did I accomplish that? Did I, improve the skill, target the weakness, whatever it is that you're trying to get out of it. Checking in with yourself before and after is really important to make sure that you are getting something out of that speech. So with that in mind, what are the kinds of practice speeches that you can get? The first one I call the trial run speech. So the goal of this is to trial run something. You have a new argument, maybe it's a new affirmative, you produce a new disadvantage, you've got some new critique or a new alternative to the same critique. There's something new about the argument that you're making that you want to try out. And as I'm sure you all know, there are some things that you can't really grasp or capture until you actually give a speech on it, right? It's you can think about it, you can call all the ev, you can have a general sense of how you want to explain it, but until you force yourself to actually do that explaining, there's an element missing and there's a thing that you just can't possibly know for sure. And so trial run speeches are really important because they allow you to kind of take that final step to make sure the thing that you produced is in its best form and is tournament ready. I would say for this one, I would recommend creating a realistic setup. So your goal should not be to give yourself some kind of softball to a C on a new disadvantage or a 1 and C that's only 2 or 3 off if that's not realistic to the types of debates that you're going to be having. But you also shouldn't put yourself through the ringer for this one. Whatever the kind of realistic thing that you should anticipate is, and that depends I think on every person because it's a question of what kinds of tournaments are you going to, what kind of bracket do you anticipate being in at that tournament. So you kind of knowing yourself, anticipating, and calibrating accordingly in this note. There are 2 kind of types of prep time that you could give yourself for this speech. So for every practice speech, you need to kind of decide what is the kind of setup I'm working with and what is the prep time that I'm allowing myself, what are the kind of prep conditions I'm going to give myself. For a trial run speech, I think there are 2 options, and I think they're both beneficial in different ways. So the first is to give yourself kind of a realistic amount of prep time. And this, I think, can be really useful for testing out, I've cut this new argument, I think I have prepared it, and I would be ready to have a debate on it. But put yourself to the test. Is it true that in, 4 to 5 minutes or whatever, you can prepare a 2 and C on this new DA? And if the answer to that becomes no, if you're floundering and you've answered, 2AC 1 and 2 when 5 minutes are up, that's a great indicator that there's something about your prep that needs to change. And that's really useful because figuring that out before the tournament instead of in round 3 or whatever, when it actually counts, is majorly beneficial. So kind of using that to stress test your blocks in your prep, I think is really useful. The second option is to give yourself infinite prep time. And that's useful too because it allows you to kind of think through the argument in detail and really refine the pieces as you go. So maybe it's the case that you've cut this argument, but you're still a little bit unsure about how you want to explain some of the nuances of it. And so giving yourself kind of infinite prep time to then work through those. Maybe you're bouncing ideas off your partner, you're talking to a coach about it, and going through that process slowly can also be really beneficial, especially because then you can kind of integrate those lessons into your blocks and prep. So I think both of these types of speeches are useful. You may ultimately want to do like a few of each before you break a new argument. Maybe you give yourself infinite prep time to kind of go through the process of figuring it out, and then once you've done that and you've integrated it into your blocks, you do a realistic prep time scenario where you have to stress test those blocks after you've learned about it. So I think those are both really beneficial and are particularly important for new arguments. And this isn't just on the neg, this is on the aft too, right? Like new affirmatives, you've got to be stress testing those. You can't give your first 2AC on a new affirmative in a real debate. Like that is, it may be okay, but it will never be as good as it could have been if you had practiced it and given it a trial run ahead of time. Okay, so the next kind of practice speech that you can give is what I call like a skill speech. So this is less about testing out any particular argument, and it's more about developing the kind of skills that you feel like you need to improve on. So maybe this is you feel like you were really slow at assembling 2ACs. Like you find it really hard to like keep up with the pace of the 1NC, and so you just need to give a bunch of 2ACs under time pressure so that you can practice it. Maybe it's true that you think your 1ARs on framework against the K are like not what they need to be. And so you need to give a bunch of framework 1ARs and target that skill in particular. So whatever it is for you, whatever the things are that you know you're weakest at or that tend to trip you up, the skill speech is nice because you can create a setup that allows you to just focus on that particular skill and kind of strip away all of the other stuff that you typically have to do in debates so that you can really focus your effort and energy and kind of feedback. So I would say for this one, it's good to make your setup kind of the right challenge level for you. Like if it is true that you really struggle in AF framework debates and you feel like you just, don't really get it yet or you're not sure how to operationalize it, I would recommend not giving yourself a like God tier 2NC to answer, right? Like that's not how you should start out here. Instead, give something that is going to challenge you but not overwhelm you. And then you can scale that up over time. So it's like, give yourself a 2NC that you feel like is just a little bit too hard for you. Once you feel like you've gotten that down, make it harder. Add more arguments. Make it a like different interpretation that maybe is trickier to deal with, right? So scaling up over time so that you're increasingly making it more and more difficult for yourself. Like if you think about any other sport or activity, it's like if you're trying to learn to run a marathon, you're not going to start by running a marathon, right? You're going to start with a smaller distance, and then over time, you're going to run further and further each time. And so the same is true here. You just need to scale yourself up so that you're constantly improving and constantly challenging yourself, but not overwhelming yourself. And then there's some other questions you can think about here too, like what works for you in terms of improving the skill and what does the skill demand of you? So in some cases, it might make sense to give yourself infinite prep time to like really think through it and figure that out, especially the first couple of times you do it. And then maybe you need to transition to limited prep time to like put yourself under pressure and be able to do it in the moment. And then also kind of depends on the skill, right? Because like if the thing you're trying to target here is assembling 2ACs quickly, giving yourself infinite time to assemble it quickly is like, it doesn't really make sense, right? So it depends on the skill you're trying to target. And this is another thing where you just have to be intentional about it. Like think in advance what it is that you're trying to get out of it and then work accordingly. And then also how many reps are you going to do? Like a lot of times I think with skilled speeches, it's not a matter of just giving 1AR on framework, right? It's giving 5, it's giving 10, 15, like giving a bunch of reps so that you're improving each and every time. Okay, the third type of speech is what I call the final boss speech. So here you want to challenge yourself. That is the goal. You should design a setup that is far more challenging than is comfortable for you. And this is really important because inevitably there are going to be debates where you feel like you are out of your depth. Like that is always going to happen, always and forever. And so it's important that you, like, for one, are able to kind of be okay in that situation. Like learning to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in debates or feeling overwhelmed and being able to kind of stay calm and work through it instead of panicking is a really important skill, right? And that's a thing that you have to have just been in some of those situations to be able to handle and to be able to get through. And so this kind of speech is useful for that because it's like, okay, well, when this happens in a real debate, it's fine. I've been here before. I know that I can stay calm and I can perform under pressure. And it also helps push you and like motivate you to like really step it up, right? I think that there's a lot to be learned from trying to give a speech that is like too hard for you, because you figure out what is it about this that is too hard for me? What are the skills that I need to work on coming out of this? And it's also really useful too, because like over time, that kind of stuff will get easier. So it's great to kind of see over time, you know, maybe a year ago you tried to give a 2AC to a 1NC that had like 8 alternate case turns, and that was just like too overwhelming. But now you can do it and like it's fine. And that's huge too, right? You want to be able to see your growth. So I think final boss speeches are really useful. Again, here I think both types of prep are like have their own unique value. So realistic prep useful because like you may actually be in this position at some point. Infinite prep is useful because you can kind of refine your approach as you go. So if you have a like 8 or 9 off 1NC and you're trying to prep a 2AC, you know, you can really think about what are the choices I would need to make in this spot and how do I want to go about making those choices in a way that's slow and refined, and that you can then take the lessons away from so that you can do it more quickly and in the moment when you need to. Yeah.
Do you think it's useful to give or to have like final boss style PRs where it's someone way better than you and you get crushed, but is that useful or no?
Define PRs.
Like practice time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be a value in that, right? Like it certainly depends, and I think there's a version of that that's ultimately not very useful, where like you just kind of have nothing and are floundering. And like there is some value to that, right? Because ultimately you'll come out of it and you can ask yourself, why is it that was way too hard for me? What are the things that really tripped me up? I think the nice thing about doing it in kind of a practice speech setting is it's like a very intense challenge, but in a way that's limited and that you can really get a lot out of. Because, I mean, as you all know, it's like if you're in an actual debate and the 2AC just like flops, the rest of the debate is pretty tough, right? And it's like the core root of that 1AR and 2AR is not the 1AR, 2AR, it's the 2AC, right? And so the nice thing about a practice speech is that you can then just target your time to like improving that particular part. But there is also value in having to go through a full debate where like the 2AC maybe made some mistakes and you have to figure out how to recover, because that is inevitably going to happen sometimes. So yeah, I think there are value in all of these things. The important thing is just that you're intentional, right? It's like, what are the things that you want to work on, and then figure out what practice regimen is going to be good for that, as opposed to the opposite.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Do you have any like advice on giving like skills practice speech going off flow?
The skill you're trying to target is just speaking off of your flow.
Yeah.
I think reps is the biggest thing here. You just have to do it. And I think there are a few things to kind of pay attention to. One of which is how are you flowing, and what are ways that you can change the way you're flowing to make it easier for you to give a speech. We talked about this some in my lab yesterday, but like, are you flowing your opponent's arguments in a way that as you glance at the flow, you can tell what the argument is, because that's going to make it way easier for you to then give a speech responding to it. And then also just developing the skill of being able to take a few words and turn them into many words, I think is a thing that you just have to do a bunch. So yeah, I think that's a great skill to target, and you can do it in a limited way. Maybe that means giving a bunch of like 2ARs off your flow. Maybe it means just giving a bunch of 2ACs on the case off your flow. And that's a thing you can do, 2 minutes, 3 minutes at a time, so that you can get in a bunch of reps. But yeah, I think that's a great skill to target. It's very worth it. And ultimately the thing that's going to help you with this is just doing it a bunch. Yeah, of course. Okay, so now let's talk about speech reviews. So why give a speech review? The main thing is that you want to improve. There was something about this debate that you'd like to make better, and you would like to work on that in the form of giving a speech. I think you must, absolutely must, be able to improve something specific. You cannot just be like, I'm going to give a review because, well, we lost this debate, so I guess I should give this speech again. Because ultimately, you're not going to get a ton out of that unless you know what it is that you want to change about the speech going in. So using kind of feedback from the judge or talking to coaches after the debate about the way that debate broke down gives you kind of specific targeted goals that you can focus on. And I really do think that's essential for getting the most out of your readers. I guess the last thing I'll mention here at the top is that I think it's useful to do this when you win and when you lose. Like, a lot of people think if you win the debate, there's no point in giving a redo, and that is not true, because inevitably, like, there's always things that you could have done better. There are always ways to kind of make the margin of your win greater. And so if you win a given debate and the judge is like, I narrowly voted affirmative, but I thought the 2AR made these missteps, like, re-give that 2AR. It's great that you pulled it off, but like, you might as well still work on improving there too. So this isn't just for when you lose debates, but also for when you win. Okay, the first kind of reading, the perfect reading. Your goal is to make it quote unquote perfect. Now, I put asterisks next to this because, like, that's not a thing. There's no such thing as a perfect speech. But the goal here is to make it as close to perfect as you can, and to work on really refining all of the kind of fine little details about it. So in this setup, you're going to give yourself infinite prep time. You're going to probably write it all out. Like, that's usually the most helpful, I think, in these scenarios. And what that looks like for you can be different. Like, maybe that means in some places of the speech, you're writing out full sentences. And other places, you just need some bullet points or whatever. But you're going to allow yourself to write out as much as is helpful for you. And I think that the reason that this redo is particularly helpful is because it allows you to kind of work through the best version of that speech and that argument. It allows you to refine your packaging, so like the ways that you're delivering things to the judges, the words and phrases that you're using, your kind of explanation, what words are you incorporating? Are there missing pieces of your internal links that you need to like make better? It helps you refine your strategies. Maybe it's the case that in the first iteration of the speech, you made some decisions that you think you should have changed, and now you have the chance to go back and make different decisions. So it's just all of the above, figuring out what is it that is the gap between the speech that I gave and the ideal version of the speech I would like to give, and you're working on refining all of those things in the middle. And I think this is also useful for familiarity, because it means that you're going to be more familiar with how to explain and package this argument the next time that you have it in a debate. Now, the one caveat I want to put here is that you should not let this mean that you're over-reliant on like writing a thing out in advance, because it would be very easy to take away from this that I should give a speech on everything, I should write it all out, and if I haven't written everything out in advance, I can't possibly give a speech on it. And I think that's ultimately really detrimental to your success in the long run. Like, maybe writing some things out, like scripting them out in advance might help you in the short term, but there is a much lower ceiling to that than there is to being able to flexibly give speeches without having it all pre-scripted. So I would be careful about that. And you should not think of giving this redo and writing it all out as I'm going to save this document, and the next time I have this debate, I'm just going to read the document that I wrote for this redo. Like, that is ultimately not helpful. But the process of writing it out, I think, is helpful, because from that you will learn how it is that you should explain it, and you will have gone through the process of thinking through it in a lot greater detail. And so you'll be able to give a better version of it even without reading what it is that you wrote out. Okay, number 2, the simulation redo. So the thing that's different about this one is that you want to simulate the speech under real circumstances. So give yourself prep time that is akin to what you had in the debate. If you gave this to an R with 3.5 minutes of prep, you should give yourself 3.5 minutes of prep to like prep it again and give it. Don't script it all out, just do what you can in the time that you have. And the reason that this redo is helpful is it helps you kind of simulate real debate conditions and practice under pressure, which is important because, like, as we've talked about, you're going to be in pressured situations in these debates. Maybe it's true that you only had 2 minutes for this 2AR, which is not ideal, but like sometimes that may happen. And so being able to perform well under those circumstances is good and important. And it also gets you kind of off your blocks and off your scripting, because you're not going to have time to script the whole thing out. And so practicing being able to perform under those conditions is really useful as well. Okay, number 3, the alternative timeline redo. So this redo is where you're going to make different decisions than you made in the original version of this speech. So maybe in a given debate, you gave a 2 and R on the ban IP counterplan, but you think actually maybe the 2 and R should have been the cap game, or should have been T. Or even if it's not the case that the 2 and R should have been something different, maybe it could have been, or you just want to practice, like, what would it be like to go for this other argument that I haven't gone for, right? There are many motivations behind why you might do this, but it's just making a decision that's different than the decision that you made in that actual debate. Prep time is up to you. I think there's value in both sides. If it's an argument that maybe you've never gone for before, it could be useful to give yourself infinite prep to like really figure out how to refine it. Maybe you want to give yourself limited prep so that you can practice the skill of doing well under pressure, right? Those kind of variables are up to you, and I think that they're all good as long as you pick with intent. In my lab, we say do things for reasons, and like that, I should have led with that at the top. That's the biggest thing about practice speeches. Do things for reasons. So like whatever prep conditions you give yourself is fine as long as you're doing it for a reason. And the important thing here is just that you practice making different choices. I think this is important because it makes you a more flexible debater. We want to avoid being overly path dependent. Like maybe it's the case that you really enjoy going for the Van IQP counterplan and you're very good at it, and that's great. But there may be debates where like the better option is for you to go for something different. And so being willing and comfortable to make those decisions, or in some cases make bold decisions, even if there's like a reason that it seems risky, like that's all really important. And so the more that you force yourself to give different kinds of 2 ARs, 2 ARs, 1 ARs, the better. And so kind of figuring out what it is about the choices that you would like to do differently, and then being able to practice that, I think, is really useful. Okay, number 4, the time pressured redo. So in this redo, the goal is to up the time pressure. You want to give the same speech that you gave, but in less time. So prep time up to you, like prep style up to you, whether you write it all out, not write it all out, whatever. The important thing here is that you're including all of the same arguments that you included the first time, but in less time. We're not taking out arguments. You were doing the same 1 AR and extending all of the same things. You're giving yourself 4 minutes to do it, 4.5 minutes to do it, 3.5 minutes to do it, however much you think you can get it down. The really big thing about this is efficiency. We all know that's like one of the most important things to getting better at debate is being able to be efficient. And so particularly if you think that efficiency is costing you things in debates, whether it's the 2 AR and you're not able to extend like as many case arguments as you like, or maybe it's the 1 AR and you feel like you're just kind of drowning under the weight of the block and not able to get out everything you would like to, being able to target efficiency is really useful for kind of solving all of those problems. So make yourself give the same speech and give yourself less time. You will be amazed at how often you can do it. Like, it takes a lot of practice, but you can get there. A kind of sidebar I want to include here is the transcription drill, which doesn't really fit into any of these buckets, but is like a side useful thing. It is the most annoying drill that you can do. And the part that sucks about it is that it's so useful. Like, it would be great if it was a waste of time and therefore you didn't have to do it, but it is genuinely one of the most useful drills that you can do if you're trying to work on efficiency. So the way that this works is like, record yourself giving a speech, listen to it and transcribe it. Do not let AI transcribe it. Like, that's missing part of the whole process here, which is you actually having to type out the words that you're saying, because you internalize a lot more what it is and like what are the places in which you're being efficient, what are the words and phrases that you're using too much, what are the things that you're over explaining, what are the things you're under explaining. Like, the process of transcribing will make all of that a lot more kind of intimately familiar for you, and also it will allow you to kind of see it in a way that's a lot more objective than just giving the speech itself or listening to the speech itself. Like, I'm sure we've all been in a position where you felt like you explained something really clearly and the judge is like, no, you didn't, right? And it's that disconnect is really weird because in your mind and based on the words that you said, it seems like that might have been obvious or like you may have done enough work to unpack it. When you make yourself transcribe it and you're able to then see the words in front of you, I think it becomes a lot easier to kind of understand that maybe there are parts of this that you thought you explained, but like reading it back to yourself now, it's a little foggier. And so the process of transcribing is good for efficiency, but it's also useful for figuring out, am I explaining things as well as I need to be? Are there things I need to change about the packaging? Things I need to spend less time on, more time on? So yeah, transcription, very useful. And I think that's like one way of going about the time pressure redo. If you want to kind of merge those together, it's like give a shorter version, transcribe it, take out all the stuff you can, make it even shorter, all of that kind of stuff. Okay. Number 5. This is the mega time pressure redo. So this is where you're going to give a different speech in less time. What I mean by that is you're going to take whatever speech it is that you would like to redo. You're going to give yourself a lot less time. Like maybe you give a 1 AR in like 3 minutes or 3.5 minutes. And as a result of that, you're going to make different choices. So You should give yourself less time and also extend fewer arguments. And the reason that this is important is that you're both practicing efficiency. You're also practicing argument choice, because it's almost always the case that you don't actually need all of the arguments that you're making in speeches. And particularly if you feel like making choices in the midst of debates is particularly challenging for you, then it's useful to do a drill like this to kind of force yourself to go through the process of figuring out what is it that I actually need. Like very often, the 1AR happens and you've extended a bunch of these different little pieces, and then like a lot of that stuff you don't actually need, or you could have used that time elsewhere. So forcing yourself to go through this process is useful because you can figure out where is it that you're making the wrong choices, and is it true that you're overextending a bunch of stuff because you're like worried you're going to miss something. The important thing here is to ask yourself, am I doing things for reasons? Is this argument serving a purpose in this debate, or am I just extending it because I feel like I should? I think this happens in all kinds of debates. It particularly happens, I think, AF versus the K. I think a lot of times it's very easy for those 1ARs to like overextend a bunch of miscellaneous stuff because you're worried you're not understanding it. You're like, what if the 2NR pivots and I don't have the things I need? And instead you should think of it as like, what are the possible 2NRs based on the block? And what are the things that I need? What are the common threads? And I think kind of giving yourself time to think through that slowly in the process of preparing this review is really useful, because you realize that you really don't actually need that much to begin with. Okay, before we move on, any questions about reviews? Okay, great. So now we have some of my miscellaneous thoughts about reviews, about getting better at debate, because ultimately that's the whole point of practice speeches and reviews, is you're trying to get better at debate. Okay, so how to stay motivated. There are some people who love giving practice speeches. I am one of those people. I love it. I do it all the time. I find that to be one of the most fun parts of debate for me, is the speaking part. For some people it's like the research, and I like that too, but I like speeches a lot more. So I am usually pretty motivated to give speeches. But I know there are plenty of people who do not feel that way and hate giving practice speeches, hate doing reviews. That is okay too. You do not have to love it. You just need to do the amount of it that you need to do to reach the competitive goals that you have. So some tips for motivation, especially if that is particularly challenging for you with respect to speeches. The first thing is giving practice speeches with a purpose, I think in and of itself will make it more motivating to do. Because, if you're doing it out of obligation, or you're doing it because you're like, man, everyone else on my team gave a redo after this tournament, I guess I'll give one. It's like that, no wonder you don't want to do that, right? But instead, if you think of it as, here is a direct purpose that I can tie to the parts of debate that do motivate me, then you'll be more inclined to do it. Some other crazy and unhinged things that I think help motivate you: track the number of speeches that you give between tournaments. I find this incredibly motivating. And it depends on the person, but I think keeping a track of, it's been, a week since the last tournament, I've given 7 speeches, or I've given 5 speeches, or I've given 2 speeches, right? That can be useful, especially if you know kind of how many speeches would I like to be giving in accordance with the amount of time that I'd like to spend on debate, its priority among other things in my life. And then having kind of a tangible number in front of you, I think is really helpful, because you can see, am I actually, making this the kind of priority that I think in my head I should be making it, or I want to be making it. And so it gives you kind of a tangible reference point for the amount of work that you're doing. If peer pressure motivates you, you can make this public, hang up a sign in your debate classroom or whatever. Be like, I am going to track my speeches publicly so that everyone can see. And therefore, if I'm not giving speeches, everyone else will know, and that maybe is motivating for you to give more speeches. You can also attach some kind of competition to it. Debaters are fans of games and fans of competition, generally speaking. So the more that you can turn this into a game and a competition, I think the more people tend to be motivated. So make it a competition with your friends on the team. Who is going to give the most number of practice speeches between this tournament and that tournament? Or, maybe we're going to have a pyramid system, whatever it is. But I think all of that can help stay motivated. And the last part too, debate is really fun, and it's more fun when you're doing it with people and you feel like you have a team around you. So maybe you and your partner are competing, which of us is going to give more practice speeches between this tournament and the next tournament. So all of that I think can help make it motivating. Really, it's ultimately kind of a question of what things do you find motivating. Like for me, I'm very motivated by competition. The peer pressure element works a little bit for me in terms of, I feel like my teammates are going to know if I'm not putting in the work, but everyone's different. So figure out what motivates you and figure out how you can kind of tie practice speeches to it. Okay, other ways to get better. The first thing is record your debates. Always, always, always record your debates. You should ask your opponents first, like don't just record them or whatever, but record your debates. If your opponents don't want you to record the whole debate, record your own speeches. Like this is invaluable, and if you are not doing this, there is a cap on the kinds of things you can learn from the debates that you're having. Because no matter what, like your memory of a given debate is going to be a bit different than what actually happened because you're getting a very narrow perspective, you're under a bunch of pressure, and it's a very particular way of kind of viewing that debate. But the ability to then go back afterwards and actually listen to the debate, listen to your own speeches from an objective perspective that's more removed from the debate at hand is invaluable for being able to figure out, like, did I actually extend this argument into 1AR? Was the warrant actually clear, or was the judge right that I just said nonsense? Like, these are all things that are really important and that you can't possibly figure out if you don't have a record of the debates that you're having. You can get coaching feedback or give yourself feedback if that's not an available option to you. Like, I think both of those are super useful. Obviously, getting coaching feedback, hugely useful, but there's also a ton of feedback that you can give yourself if you don't have someone to listen to your debates, like a coach. Because you ultimately, you know a lot of things that you need to do. Knowing that you need to do certain things in the debate is not synonymous with being able to do those things in the debate, right? So there are going to be plenty of times where you can listen to your own speeches and be like, man, these are the 3 to 5 things that I should change about this speech. Like, you are capable of doing that even without a coach. And even if a coach may be more ideal, there's still so much that you can get out of listening to your own speeches. You should also try to flow yourself. This is huge because you're always going to think that you are clearer than you probably are. And actually trying to listen to yourself and be like, can I flow this if I was a human that was not the one giving this speech is really big. And it also helps with packaging too. Like, even if the words you're saying are clear, is it delivered in a way that's flowable? Like, am I putting kind of the claims first that the judge knows what to write down? Or are the things that the judge should be writing buried in the middle of this paragraph and therefore unflowable? All of that is the kind of stuff that you really can't know for sure until you try to put yourself in the process of listening to your own debates. It also can help inform your readings. So kind of like I talked about, like your perspective on a given debate as the debate is occurring is going to be different than re-listening to it with kind of fresh ears and like some distance from it all. So I think recording your debates, hugely helpful. Cannot possibly emphasize enough how much you should be doing that. And the same can also be true of your practice speeches and your readings. Like, honestly, record everything. I record just about everything. Because you never know when you might want to go back and listen to something again to refine it. Try to take notes during decisions. Like, you should always do that at every tournament for every judge. There are a lot of different things you should be paying attention to. So, obviously, number one is which way did they vote and why. You should also figure out how do they think as a judge? Like, what are the kinds of things that helps them make this decision? Were they pretty, I cared a ton about what words I had down on my flow. Did they read evidence after the debate, and what cards did they choose to read, and what things were they looking for, and what order did they read the evidence in? Like, all of that stuff is useful just kind of separately for figuring out judge prep things, how you can adapt in front of that person the next time that you have them. So you should take notes for all of that, but also to kind of help make your reviews better. Like, what are the reasons that you lost this debate? Or what are the reasons this debate was closer than it needed to be? And then use those to inform what kinds of things you're trying to target when you read it. Lastly, watch other people's debates. Like, there is a wealth of fantastic debates on YouTube, and I think it's great to take advantage of that. There are a lot of things that you can gain from that. One is watching highly successful debaters do things and do them well, and figure out what things you would like to imitate. And by imitate, I do not mean I'm going to sit and transcribe this person's truancy and then I'm going to give it. I mean, you should learn kind of the skills that they are good at, and the ways that they package arguments or the ways that they make decisions the ways that they sound when they speak. Like, why is it that you find them more flowable than 80% of your own debates, right? Like, figure out what are the differences in the ways that they debate and what are the skills you can take from them. You should also flow them. Like, particularly if flowing is challenging for you, that is a great way to get better. And in most of these instances, you probably don't have the docs in front of you because they're just like random debate on YouTube. And I think that's kind of ideal because you can't rely on the doc. You have to flow the debate. And then lastly, you should make a decision. So anytime you're watching a debate, like if you're watching it with intent and that's your kind of focus at the time, I think you should try to make a decision. Because the process, like you're gonna pay a lot more attention if you know you have to make a decision at the end of the debate. If you're like, I'm gonna watch this as though I'm watching Netflix, like you're not gonna pay that much attention. Like the way that you think about it is gonna be different. And that's fine because maybe sometimes you want to watch a debate for other reasons, but I think a lot of the times you should be watching with the intent of making a decision. And that's also really useful because you will learn to think like a judge and you will come to appreciate the differences in the way that judges see things and the way that debaters see things. Like, we talked through some of those differences in my lab, and some of the things that we talked about were the kind of weird, incomplete information thing. Like, it's like your information as a judge in many ways is less complete than as a debater because you're not familiar with this evidence set, you haven't done the research, you haven't read all the original articles of this stuff or like know the background. On the flip side, you almost have more information sometimes because instead of seeing it from the perspective of the affirmative or the perspective of the negative, you're seeing all of the pieces kind of move around at once in a way that can be hard as a debater when you're like in the midst of it and trying to focus on particular portions of the debate. And so that kind of weird, like more and less information thing is really weird. And it's good to kind of get a grasp on that because it can inform the way that you approach trying to convince judges of whatever it is that you're debating. It also, I think, is helpful too for recognizing some of the, like, it's very easy for information to get lost between debater and judge. And I think putting yourself on the other side and realizing how easily that can happen and how not obvious a lot of the stuff that you're saying or assuming is really important too, because it will make you better at giving final rebuttals and at making sure the judge is following all along the way. Okay, that's the end of my tips and tricks. Do people have questions about practice speeches, redos, motivation, other miscellaneous things to get better at debate?
When thinking about like how to think like a judge, how do you, like, in a debate, you feel, okay, these are the things that I have to resolve, or it's like the loose ends that I have to tie. How do you make those decisions, like, very quickly?
I think it takes a lot of practice. I think two things. I think one is practice doing it more. I think the second is thinking about things very deeply and like in a specific way in advance. So like it's not just enough to think about these are what the cards I'm reading say, and like I understand those, and therefore I'm ready to win a debate. Instead, think about what does the evidence say? What's the argument I'm trying to make? Why does it beat the negative arguments or the affirmative arguments that I know they're going to say in response? And importantly, how am I going to resolve that for the judge? Because a lot of times what happens in debates is people say like half to 75% of what they would like the judge to repeat to them at the end of the debate. So like you want the judge to say, you know, I voted negative because, I voted affirmative because. And a lot of times debaters don't fully complete the end of that sentence. So they will like give the judge the pieces that they would need to draw the conclusion they would like them to draw, but they aren't drawing that conclusion for the judge, if that makes sense. So it's like, if you want the judge to decide, I voted negative because the risk of the DA is huge, like there's no impact defense, so 100% risk of this impact, and I think that the internal link to the DA complicates the case or whatever, but like you aren't putting those pieces together for them, and instead you're just like, they don't have impact defense, internal link is this, that complicates the case. It's like that's not really synthesizing those things in the way that you actually want the judge to. So thinking about what is the like sentence or sentences that I would like the judge to say back to me and starting your final rebuttal with those. And I think watching debates and having to go through that process yourself is helpful because it does help you realize how like non-obvious your conclusions can be sometimes. It's very easy for you to think that I'm going to extend these 5 arguments and they obviously fit together in this grand picture way. And like the judge may or may not get that. So, you know, drawing conclusions for them And that's the thing, that a lot of that does happen in advance, as you're thinking about the way that your argument interacts with what you know the responses are going to be. But it's also just taking some prep time before your final rebuttal to think to yourself, like, what is the RFD I want the judge to give? And I'm going to start my speech with that. I'm going to start by putting the pieces together before I like dive into the line by line, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, I hope you all got something out of this. I hope you will give a lot of really useful practice speeches and reviews throughout the year. If anyone has questions later, feel free to come find me. But other than that, you all are good to go to lunch.